Hey guys, Yips here coming at you with another video, and this one is going to be a combat analysis of Spellblade Auriel Mythic. And the reason I'm coming with this video is because I think it's important that I show you guys logs of the boss fights done by me or either done by other top warlocks, whichever I choose to show, and show you what sort of unique things that we're doing on a boss fight that you should probably pick up and do yourself. And it also gives you guys a reference, right? I can show you my combat log and talk about it and talk about what the important parts of it to look at is, and then you guys can also go and look at your combat log and compare and see if you're doing similar things, what sort of things you think you can improve on, what sort of things you're doing better. And by doing that, I think it can really help raise a lot of your guys' gameplay, okay? So first, I want to talk about the talents that I'm using on this boss fight. The talents that I'm using are right here. It's Malefic Grasp, Absolute Corruption, Howl of Terror, Sow the Seeds, and Phantom Singularity. Very powerful talents. I'm also using a Infernal pet, simply because Infernal is a very, very, very strong pet to be using on this boss fight because it is more damage whenever adds are up, and this boss has a ton of adds, okay? So the summary just basically shows you the damage of every single one of your abilities. It shows you your talents, your traits, your gear, all that good stuff, but besides that, it's not really too worthwhile looking at. The most important parts of this video that I want to cover is the graph. The graph is extremely important. The buffs is very important. I want to talk about buffs, and then I also want to talk about the casts, okay? So first thing we should be looking at is the graph, okay? Because the graph is going to be telltale of where you're doing the most damage and where you should try to optimize your DPS around, okay? And obviously on Spellblade Auriel, it is very obvious where you should be maximizing your DPS, okay? And that is at every single one of these peaks, okay? And I bet you guys can already guess where these peaks are coming from. These peaks are coming when the adds are spawning, okay? So obviously this one would correlate to the Frost, and then Fire, and then Arcane. Frost, Fire, Arcane, okay? So these peaks are corresponding to different portions of the fight where adds are happening. So obviously you're going to want to try to maximize your DPS around these peaks, okay? And I'm going to show you in the buffs how I optimize around these peaks, but it's also important to note the little baby peaks after, okay? You see these big peaks happening, but then after these big peaks, there's a little baby peak, and then it kind of dips back down, and then there's a big peak, and then a little baby peak, and then it dips back down. Big peak, and then baby peak, and then big, and then baby, okay? So I really want you guys to notice the fact that that's happening throughout the boss fight, and I want to talk about why that's happening and sort of how you're supposed to optimize around these peaks and how you're going to do the most damage, okay? So let's go into buffs and see how we're going to be doing all our damage on these peaks, okay? So you can see the graph timeline up here, and you can see the buffs down here, and this portion corresponds to the timeline on the boss, okay, when you're using these buffs. So the buffs that I really want to bring your guys' attention to is going to be the Deadwind Harvester and the Wrath of Consumption buffs, okay? And the reason I want to talk about the Deadwind Harvester and the Wrath of Consumption buffs is because they're super, super important on fights like this because there's ad spawning. So obviously when you have ad spawn, you're going to be doing more damage than normal, and that's when you're going to be wanting to use your Deadwind Harvester. And also after the ads die, you gain that Wrath of Consumption, and you're going to be wanting to maximize around that, okay? So let's look at the peaks on the boss, right? And then let's look at the Deadwind Harvester usage. Obviously in the very beginning, I use a couple little stacks just to correspond with Bloodless, but after that, you see that every single time I use my Unalesh stacks after the very beginning, or sorry, Uthalesh stacks, is where Deadwind Harvester correlates, okay? So you see here, my Deadwind Harvester is correlating to this peak, my Deadwind Harvester correlates to this peak, my Deadwind Harvester correlates to this peak, and this peak, and so on. So every single time that adds are spawning, I'm making sure I'm saving my Tormented Souls. I'm not using them on my UAs, I'm saving them for when the ads are spawning, so when the ads do spawn, I'm able to do all of this damage and have these giant, massive peaks of DPS, okay? So that's the first part of the video that I really want to bring your guys' attention to and highlight and talk about. The second part is going to be those little baby peaks that I was talking about. So remember over here when I was talking about, you see this big peak of damage and then these little baby bursts. Well, you see the majority DPS of these little baby burst windows are from Unstable Affliction. This bottom line here, this big peak, this is all Unstable Affliction damage, okay? And the reason that Unstable Affliction damage is so high during these portions and so low throughout the rest is obviously when the ads spawn, I stop casting UA. But not only that, you have Wrath of Consumption after the ads die, and that's what leads to these secondary peaks that are happening, okay? The ads die, so the ads spawn, you have this big burst of damage, but then after you have this increased single target DPS via Wrath of Consumption. So you see every single time that this little line is corresponding, it corresponds here, here, here. You see that these correlate to these portions of the graph. So that's also when you want to be using your Unalesh. So every single time that ads are dying and after the ads die is when you want to be using your Deadwind stacks. And then afterwards, that's when you want to be saving them. And that's when you want to be minimizing your DPS, okay? So maximize during the ads and then a little bit after the ads. And then once all of that's done and said, you want to be saving your resources for the next time that ads do spawn, okay? So that's how you want to analyze between the graph and the buffs. And now I want to talk about the casts, okay? Because I feel like casts are fairly important. Obviously, you want a high uptime on Drained Soul, but that's not what I'm really interested in looking at, okay? I'm kind of more interested in looking at Agony and Seed of Corruption casts, okay? So the very first one I want to look at is Seed of Corruptions, and the reason that Seed of Corruption is so important. Seed of Corruption is important because you want to be casting this every single time that ads spawn, okay? So we see here, this is obviously going to correspond to the Frost phase. So you see how I'm not using UAs before this Frost phase, right? This is the last time that I dump UAs, and until then, I'm really just generating soul shards. So you want to be making sure that you have a lot of shards that every single time ads are spawning. So you see that every single time that the Frost phase happens, I make sure that I have like 5 soul shards banked up, okay? So if you look at my unstable usage, you see that it really starts to slow down right before the Frost phase happens. And you want to be doing this before every single ad set, okay? You want to be making sure that you're not using too many unstable afflictions so you can have a maximum amount of soul shards available when those ads spawn, so you don't feel like you're starved when you're casting your Seed of Corruption, okay? It's also important to note that my Phantom Singularity usage lines up every single time I'm casting these Seeds of Corruptions, okay? So that just makes it even more evident that I'm using this DPS on the ads and not on the boss, okay? So it's really clear, like, this is where I'm maximizing my DPS, this is where I'm maximizing my DPS, this is where, and this is where, because this is where all of this damage is going from all of my shards, right? When you look at my Unstable Affliction casts, you note that after the Fire phase, this is where I'm casting a lot of my UAs. After the Arcane phase, this is where I'm casting a lot of my UAs. And that's because those phases are where the ads are dying and I'm getting my Wrath of Consumption buff back. And I'm able to do a lot of damage with that, okay? So the most important thing to note here is going to be the Seed of Corruption usage along with Unstable Affliction. You want to make sure that you're not UAing too much before the Frost and the Arcane ads as to have a high number of soul shards for when they do spawn, so you're not running yourself dry on Seed of Corruption. And also you want to be looking at if you're using Phantom Singularity every single time the ads spawn, because you don't want to see any Phantom Singularity usage in weird locations where ads are not spawning, and ads spawn about every minute and 15 seconds, so you can see those intervals here, okay? So that is this part of the graph. That has to do with the buffs, that has to do with the damage done. I want to talk a little bit about summary and then kind of wrap up with this video. So the summary is a really good place to just go and look and see how much DPS each of your abilities are doing. So you see here my Unstable Affliction did 217k and so on for the rest of my abilities. And the way that you can kind of look at this and then compare it to other Warlocks graphs is you can look at this, your DPS per ability, look at other Warlocks DPS per ability and see where they're maximizing their stuff, see if they just got lucky on Unstable Affliction. But overall, it's just a good breakdown to see, like each week, to see if you're doing a little bit better, a little bit worse on one thing or the other. The very last thing I want to touch on is make sure that you're agonying the ads when they do spawn. As you see here, I'm casting Agony on the Fell Soul and the Icing enchantments when they spawn. So the Icing enchantments are the Frost ads. Make sure that you're agonying the ads just to get that additional shard gen, okay? So this has been an analyzing a Spellblade Auriel Mythic video. I hope this guy helped you out when you're looking at your logs and how you should be playing on the boss, and I will see you guys later.